What is it now? Very well.
What?
Greetings. What, mortal? You thought of that? Very well. That was my plan. You thought of that? Very well. Agreed. Very well. I must hunt soon. That was my plan. What is it now? Very well. You thought of that? That was my plan. You thought of that? Very well. Agreed. That was my plan. You thought of that? Agreed.
First blood.
You thought of that? Very well. Agreed. Very well. You thought of that? That was my plan. You thought of that? Very well. That was my plan. Agreed. That was my plan. I hunger. You thought of that? That was my plan. Very well. Agreed. You thought of that? I must pursue. Agreed. What, mortal? You thought of that? Very well. That was my plan. Very well. Die. I must pursue. That was my plan. You thought of that? Very well. What is it now? Your soul is mine. That was my plan. Agreed. Agreed. Very well. What? Death rages. You thought of that? That was my plan. You thought of that? Agreed. What is it now? Greetings. You thought of that?
Our brethren's town is under
What is
attack.
it now? Very well. What is it now? Die. Death rages. Agreed. Very well. Agreed. That was my plan. I must pursue. Agreed. Very well. Agreed. You thought of that? That was my plan. Agreed. That was my plan. What? Agreed.
Our brethren's town is under attack.
I must hunt soon. Very well. You thought of that? What is it now? Agreed. You thought of that? What? Mortal? Die. I hunger. What is it now? That was my plan. Greetings. What is it now? Death rages. Thought of that? That was my plan. What? That was my plan. Agreed. Very well. Agreed. Die. I hunger.
Our brethren's town is under attack.
Thought of that? That was my plan. You thought of that? Agreed. That was my plan. I must pursue. That was my plan. Agreed. That was my plan. Very well. That was my plan. I must pursue. Greetings. That was my plan. Very well. Agreed. That was my plan. You thought of that. Very well. Agreed. What, mortal? Very
Our
well.
brethren's town is under attack.
You thought of that. You thought of that. What, mortal? Agreed. You thought of that. Very well.
Our brethren's town is under attack.
What is it?
Our brethren's town is under attack.
Greetings. You thought of that? Agreed. Very well. You thought of that? That was my plan. You thought of that?
More work?
Welcome to our village.
What is it now? Very well. You thought of that? That was my plan. Oh, greetings. Very well. Agreed. The night
Our
beckons.
brethren's town is under attack.
That was my plan. What, mortal? You thought of that? That was my plan. Agreed. That was my plan. What is it? Thought of that? What? Very well. I must pursue. What? I hunger. You thought of that? That was my plan.
Our brethren's
Agreed.
town is under attack.
You thought of that? That was my plan. That was my plan. What is it now? Death rages. Agreed. I hunger. You thought of that? Agreed. Greetings. Thought of that? What? Agreed. You thought of that? Death rages. I hunger. That was my plan. Greetings. Very well. Agreed. Rages. is it now? Agreed. That was my plan. I hunger. Very well. Die. What is it now? Agreed. Killing spree. That was my plan. What is it now? You thought of that? That was my plan. You thought of that? Very well. Agreed. I must hunt soon. You thought of that? What is it now? Agreed. I hunger. You thought of that? What? Greetings. That was my plan. That was my plan. You thought of that? Dominating. That was my plan. You thought of that? Very well. That was my plan. What? Very well. I must hunt soon. What is it now? What, mortal? That was my plan. You thought of that? Greetings. I must hunt soon. That was my plan. Greetings. I must hunt soon. What is it now? That was my plan. You thought of that? Very well. That was my plan. Very well. Agreed. Very well.
Killing spree. Killing spree.
What order? Very well. Agreed. You thought of that. That was my plan. Very well.
Our brethren's town is under
You thought
attack.
of that? Agreed. That was my plan. Very well. That was my plan. Greetings.
Our brethren's
Very
town
well.
is under attack.
I must hunt soon.
Our forces are under attack.
What is it now? You thought of that? Agreed. Your soul is mine. You thought of that? Greetings. I must hunt soon. You thought of that? You thought
Dominating.
What is it now? I must hunt soon. Agreed. Very well. That was my plan. You thought of that? That was my plan. Agreed. Very well. That was my plan. Greetings. What is it now? You thought of that? Agreed. What? You thought of that? That was my Agreed. That was my plan. What is it now? Agreed. Greetings. You thought of that? Death rages.
Fresh meat.
I hunger. That was my plan. Agreed. Very well. That was my plan. Die. Agreed. Very well. You thought of that? What? That was my plan. Agreed. You thought of that? That was my plan. Very well. Agreed. Very well. Agreed. Very well. You thought of that? That was my plan. You thought of that? Agreed. That was my plan. Agreed. That was my plan. Agreed. Very well. Agreed. Death rages. That was my plan.
Fresh meat.
Your soul is mine. Agreed. That was my plan. Very well. What? I must not. Agreed. Very well. Agreed. What? Die. That was my plan. You thought of that? That was my plan. Very well. What is it now?
Our forces are under attack.
Agreed. That was my plan. You thought of that? Very well. That was my plan. You thought of that? What, mortal? That was my plan.
I wish only to serve.
What is it now? Agreed. That was my plan. You thought of that? Very well. Agreed. That was my plan. You thought of that? Agreed. You thought of that? I hunger. That was my plan. Agreed. You thought of that? Agreed. You thought of that? Agreed. That was my plan. You thought of that? Death rages. That was my plan. Dominating. I hunger. You thought of that? Die. Very well. I must not be sure. You thought of that? Agreed. What? You thought of that? Agreed. Very well. Agreed. Greetings. I must hunt soon. Greetings. That was my plan. I must hunt soon. I hunger. Agreed. Very well. Greetings. Death rages. That was my plan. Very well. Agreed. Die. That was my plan. What is it now? Must hunt soon. What, mortal? You thought of that? Agreed. You thought of that? That was my plan. You thought of that? Agreed. Agreed. What? Agreed. Greetings. I hunger. What? You thought of that?
Fresh meat.
Agreed. Agreed. Thought of that? What, mortal? Agreed. That was my plan. What is it now? What, mortal? Very well. Die. What, mortal? That was my plan. Agreed. Very well. You thought of that? Agreed. You thought of that? Agreed. I hunger. I must hunger soon. You thought of that? Very well. You thought of that? Agreed. Very well. You thought of
Our
that?
veteran's town is
That
under
was my
attack.
plan. You must hunt. What is it now? You thought of that? What? Agreed. You thought of that? That was my plan. Agreed. I must hunt soon. Very well. You thought of that? Greetings. Very well. That was my plan. You thought of that? Very well. You thought of that? That was my plan. Agreed. Agreed. That was my plan. I must stop here. Thought of that. Very well. That was my plan. Very well. Agreed.
Double kill.
That was my plan. Very well. One more. Agreed. Very well. Agreed. Very well. You thought of that? Agreed. What is it now? You thought of that?
Double kill.
I must hunt soon. That was my plan.